Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, everybody. Welcome to today's Art of Procurement interview. I'm here at the SIG Spring Summit in Washington, D.C., and I'm joined by Tom Beaty, the founder and CEO of Insight Sourcing Group and Spend HQ. So, Tom, thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. One of the things I wanted to talk about first, and it's actually not necessarily procurement related, but whenever I see, well, not whenever, but I see a lot about Insight Sourcing Group and kind of your approach to being an employer of choice. I know that you've won a number of awards in the Atlanta area, and that's something pretty unusual to the procurement space, to see that kind of thing come along. Yeah. I wonder if you could just explain, what are some of the, one, why is that so important to you, I guess, but two, what are some of the things that you do to really focus on making Insight Sourcing Group an employer of choice?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and one near and dear to my heart. We've actually recently won a national award where we were named the number one boutique consulting firm to work for in the whole country.
Congratulations!
Thank you, by Vault.com. But yeah, we are fortunate that we're recognized for that, and a lot of those are based on employee feedback. So it's pretty real and as to what's going on. When I started my firm in 2002, I had worked for several other companies, and I really never found the culture that I was looking for personally.
Yeah.
I wanted one with high integrity that was highly client-oriented and was not all about the money. It was all about the outcomes and the results, and was really all about pursuing excellence for the sake of excellence itself. And so we started the firm, my dog and I, in my basement, and we came up with 4 core values. And one of them was excellence in execution. One of them was people matter most. One of them was integrity above all, and the fourth was focus on client results. And those have been our guiding principles and really have not changed. And so we make tremendous investments in the people on our team, both to, first of all, we have a very rigorous recruiting and screening process, and a lot of it comes down to fit.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to, there are plenty of people that could do the job, but they're not a great fit.
Yeah.
Because we spend so much time at work, you really need to really enjoy the folks you work with and be having a good time. So then we also invest to create those opportunities. So we may take everybody out to play whirly ball, which is this crazy game in bumper cars, or we may have a party with a band, and in the office we'll have music come in, and we have almost a lounge set up. And so it's very common to see folks form close friendships and be playing foosball in the afternoon or whatever. And part of that is we expect a lot of our folks. We expect them to work really hard, but we don't, we want them to be balanced as well. Right. So we try to create those opportunities. So that's a big part of it. The second piece is particularly our younger staff. We're hiring some of the best folks out of undergrad. We compete with the big strategy firms for talent, and we have a different model that's more compelling for certain folks. And so it's almost a moral imperative when you bring somebody with that agile of a mind and capability to really develop them and create opportunities. So we do a lot around career development. There's a lot of clarity around how do I get to the next level. They get tons of feedback. And then we've recently launched what I think will be fairly unique leadership development program. One of our goals is to be world-class in leadership development. So we launched a 2-year effort to get really good at that, and we're getting ready to roll that out this summer.
Interesting. So what does world-class in leadership development look like?
Well, one of the things that's different about us is we don't have any outside funding and we don't have any debt. That's very unusual on the technology side, and on the consulting side it's maybe a little less unusual. And we don't know what our future holds, but we're not building the business to sell it. And so the question then becomes, well, gosh, our leadership team are mostly relatively young, late 40s, early 50s, but what happens in 10 years? And we have extremely low turnover. So we had 3.3% last year and 0% the year before in our consulting group. Right. And so we've got the folks that we hired years ago that have been with us 10, 12 years doing nothing but strategic sourcing and procurement, and as well as in some of our other business units. And so it's how do we prepare them for the next level? Worst case, we get, they become better leaders just in the short run, but the hope is that both in the long run in their professional life, but also maybe even in their personal life.
What do you think a CPO, a procurement leader listening in today, could actually take from the way that you've built your organizational culture and kind of apply that to building the culture within their procurement organization?
I think that's a great question. I think it's probably easier than they would think, right? They think they're overly influenced by the main culture, but at the end of the day, the primary impact on an employee are the people, their manager, their people around them. So creating an environment that's heavy on mentoring, creating an environment where there's a lot of feedback, a lot of desire for people to improve and develop, where even the leader, like for example, I often ask for feedback. If I go on a sales call with the newest person in the company, afterwards I say, hey, tell me what I could work on, because I can't see myself. And so really creating that environment, that culture. Secondly, creating events and activities where you can just have fun. And the key, I think, I should have said first, is make sure you hire folks that are all sort of pointed in the same direction, right? Yeah. They're not 9-to-5ers. They're trying to achieve and trying to grow, and then put them in a position to do that. Yeah. And I think if I were a CPO, I think I would celebrate when I took one of my folks up a couple levels in procurement, and then maybe they exited into another part of the organization. Yeah. Because I think that's going to happen anyway if you do it right. So you might as well celebrate.
Yeah, kind of give it and set yourself up to proactively give people the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, because if you don't, then you'll have trouble attracting the next wave in, right?
When we chatted before we started to record, we were talking a little bit about digitization in procurement. We're here at a conference, and I've been to a few conferences, I'm sure that you have recently, where digitization is a big theme. But you have some interesting opinions, which I think I probably share most of them, around what digitization actually means. I'd love for your perspective on, is this the next big thing, or is it just a new name for some marketing, some hype, and there's maybe not that much behind it.
Right. Yeah, it does feel, in my view, kind of like a wrapper. I think a wrapper around some things that already exist. Yeah. The concept of digitization of procurement, the way it's being talked about, there's not a lot of, I guess, if you will, specifics that are new. And so there's a little bit of hype to it. I think the other thing is, in my career, despite the fact that I have a technology firm and I actually built a technology prior to this firm as well, I've become a bit of a technology minimalist. And part of that is doing one of my first sourcing projects when I was at a Big Four consulting firm was a software selection for a division of Lockheed Martin. Yep. And I just remember that they had their requirements and needs they were trying to solve, but once they began to see the new software, their requirement lists increased exponentially. And so it created this really complex set of requirements that I had to hammer down by something like 90% to make it viable. But all of that new functionality and capability created tremendous execution risk on the deployment. And so it made it less likely to have success because they were saying, oh, that module, yeah, we want that. And so that's part of it, right, is the breadth and the complexity of what you're trying to achieve, I think, is increased because the software providers need to create new stuff to buy. Yeah. But the second thing is, I'm not a technology minimalist because I'm a Luddite or some sort of just a skeptical person by nature. Yeah. We've met with 1,500, 2,000 companies with Insight Sourcing Group, and we've worked with about 800 of them. And I've never ever had a client where we walked into to perform strategic sourcing that handed us sourcing ready data the day we arrived. Yeah. And those folks owned every software under the sun. Some of them were mature, some of them were immature. They were everywhere on the spectrum. And for whatever reason, it seems to me that the technology that's already in place is not necessarily fulfilling the promises of good data. And so then that raises the question of, what else is potentially a challenge? Yeah.
Yeah, my view is, I think it's evolved and matured, perhaps even as I've been doing the show, because it's easy to get blinded by some of the marketing and all these wonderful things that technology will be able to do for us. And I do fundamentally believe that technology is going to reshape what it means to be a procurement professional. How we do our job, where we need to focus. So it's not that it's something that I'm against, but it's just about thinking about where you prioritize as well. For me, is I spoke to companies who are interested in how do they take advantage of RPA, for example, and then ask the question about spend data. Well, show me your spend data. Do you have good spend data? And the answer is, not really. We're still struggling. We don't really know what our spend looks like. So I always encourage companies to really think about the basics and focus on the basics first. Get the get them to a position where technology can take them to the next level, rather than looking at technology as being the solution to all their problems?
I would agree with you completely, and I think it's actually a bigger landmine issue than some people recognize. I've written a white paper on this. Basically, it's a CPO's kind of first 100 days or whatever things to watch out for. And for whatever reason, new folks that take on the role seem to turn their attention to technology first. And I think part of it is they hear all the marketing stuff and they hear all their peers and everybody talks about technology. But there's also, I think, a desire to get your hands around things and control, and there's a sense that technology is the way to do it. And my experience is that's not the way to do it. Right. I've seen a lot of CPOs get flipped out after 2 to 3 years because they took all their internal equity and relationship capital and focused it on getting approval to buy something expensive, implementing something that forced a bunch of people to change the way they do stuff that they didn't like, and then they got to be the procurement cop to hit people in the hand when they didn't do something correctly. So, and by the way, it takes a year and a half, 2 years, and then you got to wait another year to get the data. So all that time, there's a lot of sourcing opportunities that were laying there latent, just wasting money. And so, as an example, at breakfast this morning, I was sitting next to a brand new chief procurement officer who had moved into the role out of technology, which is unusual but more common these days. And he was asking everybody about the technology they used. And my comment to him was, well, have you consolidated all your spend, right? And much less know what it is. But if you have 75 temp labor providers, it probably doesn't make sense to try to automate that until you've consolidated, sourced it, put contracts in place, and structured those contracts so that you can then manage them well in the back end. And then, he was asking about contract management. Well, why would you want to load in 75 contracts instead of, 2 maybe? And so it just doesn't make any sense to me to go tech first. And then of course, from a career perspective, if you get a bunch of wins, if you're a CPO that walks in and says, I don't want to spend a ton of money on this complex enterprise procurement system, I think the CFO will probably sit back and go, you're a little different. I like what you're saying.
You mentioned actually about CPO that you talked to being new from technology into procurement. Do you see that more often now, that CPOs or procurement at the exec level, that the organizations are bringing folks in from the outside rather than just promoting up from within?
Well, in this case, it was from outside the procurement organization, but inside the company. So I'm seeing that more and more of where folks are bringing in non-procurement professionals into leadership roles in procurement. And I don't know that it's necessarily a reflection of the talent that's currently in procurement. Maybe they're just immature. But for example, we have a client where the CFO moved into the CPO role.
Interesting.
Which you don't see very often.
No. I see more and more people from the outside, but as you say, I think my experience is the same. It's people from within an organization, just a non-procurement role, which speaks to alignment, doesn't it? That perhaps the person who's making that decision or the committee that's making that decision don't necessarily see the procurement function today as being one that's aligned with the business, and so they're bringing people in from the business to better bridge that gap.
Well, I think that's very true, because if you look at the average procurement organization, they're somewhere on the spectrum of tactical to strategic, and generally they get overwhelmed by the tactical activities, so they tend to be a little bit more tactical. The second thing is they don't have great data and can't answer very basic questions like, what do we spend with this vendor who's also now we're doing a proposal for, right? And it takes 3 days.
A week.
You get the data, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. And whereas if you have a good spend analytics solution, we have clients that say, the number one thing is the CFO calls and I can answer while I'm on the phone with them, right? And so you've got to have that as just table stakes. We talk about the hype around digitization and around AI and machine learning and all those things, of which, by the way, I'm pretty heavy into machine learning and AI right now because of the technology work we're doing. And candidly, in some cases it's great, in some cases it doesn't make any sense at all. And I've gotten deep in the weeds to try to understand it, and and it just isn't the panacea for everything. But the number one thing, if I were running a procurement organization, that I would want, if I didn't have before I bought technology, is really good data analysts. That's one of the things I see missing, are really hardcore data folks that can get in and make sense of this unstructured data that's terrible. Because how can you design your requirements for future technology system if you really haven't gotten to the point where you know what really good looks like? And you can't know what really good looks like if you're just taking the data coming out of your systems. So it's almost like there needs to be a cleanup. There needs to be that skill set more heavily promoted within procurement, in my view.
Do you see more people hiring for data scientists or for analysts in procurement than in the past, or do you think we're not there yet?
I see procurement leaders struggling to attract that type of talent.
Okay.
Yeah, the challenge is that procurement is, despite the fact that I think it's amazing, a lot of people don't think it's sexy.
Yep.
And because of what you said maybe earlier, where procurement maybe is not looked upon as aligned with the business, it just isn't drawing the level of talent in some cases. In my universe, in the consulting world, we bring in people all the time who are like, I never thought I would be in procurement. And I said, you know what? I didn't either.
Yeah. It's more of a natural career path to be in a consulting or an advisory
consulting firm. Yeah, you can learn different skill sets.
Yeah.
So that's where procurement organizations, I think, need to begin to create a different value proposition for the employees, other than, hey, we got to buy stuff and we got to save money. It's how can you be developed here that maybe is unique and different, and how do you get a lens on the business nobody else has? How do you get skills nobody else has? And so those are the kind of things I think that are important. But I don't see procurement organizations hiring data scientists.
Right.
I do see a lot of third parties popping up with data scientists because it's clearly a need.
Yeah.
The one thing that we see, and this is a little bit of a value proposition from our side, is most of those third parties are just crazy smart technically, MIT gurus, but they don't have any procurement experience.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the analysis we're seeing coming out now is really cool technically, but it isn't necessarily actionable because it's not informed by deep expertise.
Right. It's still just it's not intelligence. It's information, but it's not necessarily intelligence.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I mean, even it's really funny because it's this weird disconnect, and it's the greatest aha I've had probably. I've had two major ahas running this business, and that was one of them. And it was, I just could not understand how there was so much hype around the technology and how so many folks were so excited, and I just didn't get it because I would go out and see the output, and it just didn't make any sense. And people just kept making the same mistake over and over and over and investing their careers and money into these technology solutions. And then I finally figured it out. If you do go out and research any of these solutions, there's almost no data out there except that provided by the providers, by the salespeople. Yeah. And so then the second question comes, okay, if they're controlling the narrative, right, if the software firms are controlling the narrative, I'm not suggesting it's like some evil conspiracy. It just is what it is, right? Yeah. They've got big budgets. But the question is, why are they promoting something that doesn't work? That doesn't make any sense, right? That's not a sustainable business model. And so the conclusion that I came to, the big aha, is they don't know it doesn't work because they don't use it, right? They think it works. And I mean, I've interviewed folks that talk about how great, the implementation was at a client. I've been into that same client and seen wasn't great. And it's because they don't fully understand how to utilize the data for its intended purpose. And that's why I think if I can kind of position this as part of our value prop, that's why I think Spend HQ is so unique, is because if you walked around my consulting company, you'd see Spend HQ up on the desktops of a third on any given day of our consultants, because we use it every day for its intended purpose. And so it's that we think that expertise is what's really missing in the industry, because basically what you have is a bunch of really smart people who say, hey, there's a nasty problem I want to solve. Let's go apply ourselves to procurement. But they don't necessarily have the depth.
Right. You mentioned about for example, software, the big players in the industry kind of controlling some of the narrative because they have the marketing budgets to do that. And that part of that to me is because as procurement organizations, we're not necessarily investing in independent research. And I wonder if you have any view or perspective on perhaps why we allow that to happen, versus there's value in independent research or value in getting different perspectives or whatever it may be, because it just doesn't seem like a business model has emerged yet where procurement leaders are willing to make that investment. To make the pay, I mean, clearly when you say we, right, there's got to be a we, right? It can't be done company by company. It'd have to be an organization that made that choice. And the only way it would ever work is if that organization didn't take any money from the software industry, because no matter what the initial intentions are, ultimately you build an organization, that organization burns off cash, and you've got to replace that cash from somewhere, right? And the vendors typically are much more aggressive. And then you got to, and this is just a little bit of an aside, but you ask yourself, well, why are they willing to spend so much more money than a procurement organization? If you put 100 procurement organizations, what they would spend, it's because the valuation differential on the software side is so great that the payback is just so huge if they can win. They get the bigger multiple just being being a software firm. Yeah, that's right. I want to just kind of segue into today and the session that you have today. I wonder if you could share a little bit about what you're actually presenting at SIG.
Sure. Well, the title of it is "What Comes After Sourcing," and the talk is inspired by just a massive amount of data that we have and the insights that we've drawn from them. We've got $1.5 trillion with a T, of spend data, and this is from all kinds of companies. We work with Fortune 10 companies. We work with a lot of brand names that you'd be familiar with. We work with major universities. We work with private equity firms. We probably have over 150 private equity portfolio companies we get data from on a regular basis. So we've got hundreds of companies that we're receiving data from, and we're very careful with that data from a confidentiality perspective. However, on behalf of our clients, we've done analysis to try to see, for example, compliance rates. What percent in a category of spend that's supposed to go to vendor X actually goes to vendor X versus goes to a rogue vendor or a maverick vendor. And in indirect spend, it consistently is around 60% goes to the correct vendor. And we've got different ways that we've modeled that and looked at it, and we've torn it apart, and we've interviewed clients to validate on a sampling basis. And that data is pretty consistent with other research firms have seen, but 60%. And you think about that, and that's crazy. Someone touted, let's say, 10 million in savings, and they delivered at best 6. Right? But it's so consistent across different companies, regardless of the maturity level, that you just have to begin to wonder what's going on. And then secondly, we are not an outsourcing firm. We don't take over jobs. We don't take over the roles of internal employees. We generally are brought in to help with strategic sourcing when there's categories they don't have expertise in, or that they just need to move faster than they can.
They just can't touch because they don't have the bandwidth.
Don't have the bandwidth, or just maybe they're built a tactical organization, and just strategic sourcing, it's a learning opportunity for them to see a firm like ours do that. But anyway, we have, over the years, a couple clients that have said, hey, we want you to stay involved to manage these categories and teach people how to do it. And we've chosen to do it, and it's frankly expensive because they pay us like a consultant in the past, right? And that's what we're fixing now. But anyway, so the lesson learned from that was this one company, we sourced about 48 categories, which is a lot on the non-indirect side. 2,000 location retailer. They would have had much lower compliance. We got it up to close to 100%. Just by monitoring the spend analytics, right? And then doing a couple of best practices. The second thing that was fascinating, though, is we got the vendors during the sourcing process had to give us reports in a certain format by a certain date, and there were significant liquidated damages if they messed up. And so the vendors were giving us the data we needed to manage the category. The data coming out of our client system was not usable. Right? And you think, well, why would that be? Well, part of it is the vendor doesn't want you to have that data, and you can only get it in the sourcing process. The other part is their P2P system or whatever is designed for all categories, not one category, and the vendor systems are designed for their own. So anyway, we get all that data, and we developed all the hooks at a category level of how you really analyze it. And one of the things we found was just massive vendor gamesmanship. It's almost as if sourcing professionals have gotten too good at their job, and vendors are taking deals that they really can't afford to take with the intent of not honoring the contract later, because it was so consistent across different categories, and not every vendor, but it was dramatic. And so we found basically 15 to 17% savings leakage that we were able to recapture from things like they charged the wrong price. One location didn't implement the new pricing right out of 40 or whatever. One vendor was supposed to charge X per hour for this and use this kind of resource, used an upgraded resource for a lower task, and they would just they would charge trip charges that contractually we had eliminated, and they probably didn't even know they were doing it. Right? It's just they normally charge trip charges, and so nobody was minding the store. And the way the data comes in from the internal systems or from the traditional data that comes in from the vendor is just, it's hard. It's Byzantine. It's a project to go through. And so what we're trying to create and what we're building is a model that I'm presenting today, not as a solution that we offer, but a solution people could develop themselves, but essentially is to leverage the sourcing process to get data rights from the vendor, to negotiate the exact data that you need, kind of begin with the end in mind to manage the category at a world-class level. And so you get the data to come in, and for example, we're doing a project for a company that has cell towers, and there's 782 vendors that we're getting data from every month just for one category. It's complex. The data comes in, we create using tools, off-the-shelf tools to consolidate the data, and then using, in this case it's too big for Excel, but using something like an Excel or Tableau or whatever to basically perform the analysis that you need to perform to pop all the insights. So in the retailer case, across 2,000 locations, let's look at spend per location per square foot for store supplies. And what that does is it gives us a metric that we can use to see outliers.
Yeah.
And so we're able to pop the outliers. So we're able to run that analysis and pop, hey, these 42 stores, there's something going on. There's waste, there's theft, there's something. And so we're able to pop that. And then it's a lot of hard work to build that analysis, and it takes a lot of expertise in the category to understand the levers. But what we're creating is once you build it once, then you just dump in data and the insights pop out. And so our framework is analytics, insights, and actions. And so the thought is the insights pop out, the procurement professional then takes that data, right, which is, I mean, it's got it right there, and they convert those into action steps that need to be performed by some stakeholders. So, for example, go to the vendor and, the new items they introduced that are not in the contract, take those out of the program or whatever, or negotiate a better price. This location that's not using the proper supplier, fix that. And so then you get an action list with dollars associated, and you know exactly what you can do. And we're building that as a business, and we're typically getting CFO, CEO level visibility of that list. And so the list gets done.
Yeah.
And then you're really able to understand what savings looks like at the end. And one piece I didn't mention in the beginning is you've got to negotiate with finance to say, okay, here's what we can do. Is this acceptable? If I show you this, will you accept the savings?
Yeah, so they're on board as opposed to pushing back, because 60% of the savings, because you have so much savings leakage, and we're saying we're going to save you 10 million, we're really saving you 6 million, let's say. They're not believing in our numbers. So that at least making sure that finance are really involved, bring some accountability, some buy-in from their perspective, so they actually believe the numbers when they see them.
That's right. And so if you do it right, it's pretty lean. It's fairly inexpensive. You don't need a large staff. You need some analysts, and obviously we're offering it as a service, but you get the analysis done once, and then it's relatively repeatable.
Yeah.
But the other thing that comes out of it is demand management opportunities. Yeah. And so you have an opportunity to get a second bite of the savings apple through that.
Yeah, and you can look at, so in the ranking scenario, you can look at those locations in that example that are doing really well, and those outliers on the top end, and actually then model those behaviors along the rest. But you've now actually identified who those are.
Exactly, yeah. And the other thing you'll see, like in the case of maintenance of equipment, you'll see the volumetrics around service calls for certain pieces of equipment. Maybe it's time to replace them, right? And it feeds into your break fix and capital equipment strategy.
And it was interesting to me that when we think about leakage, the first thing that usually comes to mind is it's rogue spend. So it's somebody it goes to our old policeman hat of going and telling the organization they should be buying the contracts that we'd put in place. And obviously there's reasons why folks inside an organization may not be doing that, because we may have put the wrong deal in place, but also because they just don't want to go along with it. But it's interesting to think about that so much of that leakage actually comes from the supplier side. And that's not something that I'd particularly thought about. I'd always thought about it being an internal management perspective versus actually the suppliers aren't doing what they said that they would do and what they're contractually on the hook to do.
I mean, it's candidly, it's brazen. And and again, we're talking indirect spend primarily. But one of just a little funny anecdote is we've figured out it takes 7 to 9 months for them to finally figure out that they're not going to get away with it anymore. Right. And more like magic, it stops. And so that's what leads me to believe that there's some intent behind it.
Right.
Second thing is we track pricing errors, and oftentimes they're pricing errors in favor of the client, but the net balance, it's always in favor of the vendor.
Right. They're always coming out ahead. As we think about wrapping up, I have a question about category strategy and category management. I'm sure that you're involved in a building of a lot of strategies, and I've been involved in the building of a lot before. And I just wanted your opinion, because I see so many times, we build category plans, but we do it in isolation of ourselves, and then we go to a stakeholder and say, okay, here's my plan, it's got a nice bow on top, these are all the things that we're going to do, and then we wonder why it's difficult to get buy-in, which makes me question category management in of itself. Is there really any value in us doing that? Should we be making sure that we have that alignment or not doing it at all? I just wonder what you see in day-to-day, whether you see now more and more organizations taking category management as more of a collaboration, or you still see a lot of examples of where it's very much we're going to push a strategy on you, stakeholder, based on all the things that we know?
Yeah, well, I would say that latter is not the good way to do it.
No, but that's what I kind of see.
Yeah, but you do see, yes.
Yeah.
Well, we have a procurement transformation practice, so we help build category management organizations and playbooks and all of this deep stuff. And one of the things I see is a lot of category management organizations, start with great intent, and then it sort of diverts into something else, right? We call it the tyranny of the tactical. They get buried in other areas, or they get too sophisticated, right? They're all about tracking indices and things like that, which is fun in some categories, but sometimes it's just hard to, it's almost like there's a pile of money laying over here that we're ignoring for this little pile over here. And but to your point, being a good consultant is important as a procurement person, and a good consultant would never I believe procurement organizations should think of themselves as a third-party consulting firm, because if they did, it'd fix that.
I completely agree with you.
Never shove your thought process down a client's belief or face or whatever. You would instead go see what their point of view is, what their opinion is, and you would begin with that. Consultants sometimes get knocked for taking someone's watch and telling them what time it is, so don't do that either, right? You've got to get their point of view, and then you've got to inject your own expertise and use the overwhelming weight of facts and logic, as we call it, to perhaps convince the stakeholder that a point of view is maybe a little bit different than theirs. But if you don't engage them on the front end, your odds of getting them on the back end are very low. And that friction we see a lot between procurement and other organizations. And candidly, part of it is there's a style of procurement leader that's just sort of abrasive and maybe more known for beating up vendors. And they tend to not do as well on the inside. And it's just not a great model. You really need a consultative type person. You need candidly, you need somebody with some sales genes. I mean, that's the greatest irony to me is procurement. The average procurement person in the past, not so much today, but 10 years ago, was like the absolute opposite side of the coin of a salesperson. But who did they deal with all day long? And it just was really the art of nuance was difficult because of the personality clash.
And I think that and I see there's more acceptance or more understanding of that, whereas before as procurement, we may have looked at sales as being the enemy. Now we're realizing that actually we're probably more of a salesperson than we thought we were or gave ourselves credit for or even wanted to be. And it has aligned a little bit with your comment, which I really like, and because it's something that I strongly believe in, having been on the service provider side as well, is that every procurement function should see themselves as an independent business within the company. So you've got to make your value proposition as compelling as you possibly can to the people you want to work with, as opposed to just assuming that you exist and so they're going to work with you.
Absolutely. Yeah. The worst thing you can get is a mandate.
Right.
I mean, that basically, you might as well start prepping your resume because you're just going to tick everybody off, and the 1,000 cuts are going to come. And anyway, so that's very interesting. Well,
I know that we're running out of time here, Tom, so I just wanted one final question. This is always the easy one. That's that if listeners would like to know a little bit more about Insight Sourcing Group, about Spend HQ, if they'd like to reach out to you personally, where would be the best place that they could go?
Sure. Well, we've got our websites at insightsourcing.com and then spendhq.com. And they're welcome to email me. It's tbeaty@insightsourcing.com, which will probably be somewhere on your podcast.
What I'll do, I'll include those in the show notes for the episode. So those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/insightsourcinggroup. That's artofprocurement.com/insightsourcinggroup. So Tom, thank you very much for taking time out of the event this week. It was great to meet you and have you on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for doing this and for inviting me to join you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.